Kia ora and welcome to Whānau Mārama New Zealand International Film Festival 2024. Film Festival Panel Discussions offer a unique platform for filmmakers, actors and industry professionals to share insights, discuss creative processes and engage in meaningful discussions about the wider context of their work. Today's featured panel discussion, titled Statues Also Die, is framed around Marty Diop's acclaimed film, Dahomey. Dahomey explores the repatriation and reanimation of stolen Taonga following the repatriation of 26 artefacts stolen by French soldiers from the Kingdom of Dahomey in 1892, as they are returned to what is now the Republic of Benin. Acclaimed Aotearoa visual artists Willis Thompson and Yana Dombrowsky-M'Baye joined us to bring the conversation of repatriating stolen Taonga into a local context in this lucid and nuanced discussion. This panel discussion was recorded live at the Civic Theatre in Tāmaki Makaurau Auckland on Saturday the 10th of August as part of Whānau Mārama New Zealand International Film Festival 2024. This panel was chaired by Becky Hemus and hosted in partnership with Arts News Aotearoa. Enjoy.
So thank you for coming and thank you for coming to the talk. My name is Becky. I run Art News Aotearoa and also the Art Paper, two of New Zealand's kind of main contemporary art magazines. So when we were speaking to the film festival about partnering on a film, we immediately really resonated with the idea of speaking to Dahomey and what that might mean within a contemporary context in Aotearoa. And I think that a lot of artists that are making work that is really resonant, it's dealing with things that are happening today and things that are impactful to people's lives, and that's a film like Dahomey or speaking about decolonisation is something that I think a lot of the art that we deal with in the magazine, that kind of it sits at its core. So I'm really lucky to have two incredible artists with me today. We have Willis Thompson. Luke is an artist and philosopher of Fijian origin who lives and works here in Tāmaki Makaurau. He studied at Eland School of Fine Arts and Stadelschule in Frankfurt and was the winner of the Walters Prize in 2014. The Walters Prize is currently on at the Auckland Art Gallery at the moment, and was also a nominee for the Turner Prize in 2018. Yana Dombrowsky-M'Baye is an artist and educator from Tāmaki Makaurau. Yana's matrilineal ancestry harkens to Senegal and France, and her patrilineal lineage is of Polish and Czechoslovakian descent. Across film, site-responsive installation and sculpture, Yana's practice is a poetic inquiry into material and immaterial temporalities across human and more than human scales. So we felt that these two artists would be great to speak to the film because their work deals with a few of the threads that come up. I thought that I would start by asking both of you what some of your favourite moments in the film were. Should we start with you, Yana?
Hi. Thank you for the introduction, Becky. I would say probably the underlying sort of poetic narrative of the statuette of King Gezo was probably what I responded to the most. I think the use of the poetic, I think the text itself was really interesting, and I quite like how this being's position is like never quite fixed, you know, even when it arrives in Benin, that's sort of quite speculative, and it's like, oh, is this it? This was not what I was expecting of this place that I left so long ago, it's so different now, and so there's a kind of uncertainty to the narrative that I really appreciated, and I also think on a technical level, sonically, the way that they played with the voice was quite, it kind of gave me tingles, and yeah, it was like very engaging in that way. So probably that.
Yeah, I would. Okay. Kia ora koutou ni sabol vinaka. I would say that the first thing that strikes me is the way that it is a very sonic film. And particularly, you know, I loved Den Blunt, and I loved the way that music sounded utterly different placed with those images. But particularly the moment where the screen goes black and the screws get put into the crate as a kind of injunction against images to represent the kind of blacking out of the object's sort of vision. That was kind of like incredibly moving to me. And I think if you know my work, you know, I'm quite interested in when the sound leaves the film, runs away from the film perhaps. And then the thing that really struck me today is how much it is a film in the tradition of labor films, that you don't really see anyone not working. And the very first image, right, which is absent of a person, but we can assume is likely a young African man in Paris selling those little trinkets, right? That is work. So I'm really interested that in a way, overproduction and the ways we are kind of held by capitalism, that there is not really any rest or respite ever, is the kind of difference between the object and the world.
At the start of the film, Marty Diop refers to the artworks as having endured captivity, and we're used to seeing language like theft and looting and stolen to describe these artefacts and the means that they've ended up in Western institutions. But describing the objects themselves as captives invokes the perspective of them. And there's also this emphasis on enslavement in the sculptures themselves with the depictions on the throne. And you're both attuned in different ways to how objects and materials act as a conduit for history and culture. What do you make of the framing of the objects as captives?
I think it's, I think it was quite well done and quite interesting. Like, I think what struck me most in terms of the movement of the objects, like they've been repatriated, but they've moved from one glass case to another, and as opposed to being returned to the palace or the site of sort of worship that they were looted from, that they've actually just moved from the same ideas and regulations and sort of museumologies of this captivity just into another. And I mean, that's what sort of like tied, like, you know, the sort of resistance against this sort of Eurocentric idea that, or this defense for repatriation, that these objects shouldn't go back to Africa, because if they do, there's no sort of systems or means of conservation that are in place to maintain the status or the state of the object. Thus, they should stay in France, because that's where they'll, you know, their state will be conserved the longest. And so even just to get the objects back to Benin, where they come from, they still have to stay in this, these systems of like care and sort of physical, material process. So yeah, in many ways, even though they have been repatriated, it's only under the conditions that they stay within these processes of conservation that are still very Eurocentric. They're not actually being honoured in their initial actual function or their whole reason for existence, which would be, you know, to not be in a glass case and possibly erode and actually not, and be this temporal, these temporal objects.
Yeah, my response is pretty similar to that. I totally tautoko what you've just said. I would kind of add, like, simply to reaffirm it, that ideology of conservation is utterly toxic. And I remember being in the Weltkulturen Museum in Frankfurt and asking the conservators, how long are you extending the lifespan of these materials? Like, what is the goal? And totally ironically, they responded, 1,000 years. And it's like, what on earth is the world going to be like in 1,000 years? And that's particularly dark when you think about climate and ecological destruction that we are facing already. To think perhaps these are supposed to outlive the people who made them completely. And then the thing about captivity. I mean, I think about it because I've spent time in carceral institutions. And when you go in, the first thing you realize is that your rights have been taken away. And then you realize you've lost something you never had in the first place. There are no rights. And the objects kind of are in a similar question, right? They are there is not just, there is this false notion that their care, which has been decided from a Western perspective, is in the best interest of the thing. And it's very infantilizing to the people who made it. And the people who made it, or the places these objects come from, have also imbibed that ideology. So if you go to Fiji and you talk to Teresi Vundilo, who's a kind of incredible museum worker and thinker, she will also say, we don't want these things back because we can't care for them, right? So that has also been, I think, imbibed the world over. And I think we have to take this radical position. Return everything now, even if it winds up in the hands of Saudi dictators, even if it, moves on the tribal art market, even if some is lost to capitalism, even if juntas and regimes put it in their private palaces, and let the people figure it out themselves what to do, right? So that kind of would replace care in my mind. And that is an abolitionist solution. That is an anti-prison solution. Yes. It is a democratic solution, right?
And what do you think of when they say that 90% of cultural... Did you have a question?
A comment.
Yes.
You're all free to go to the Dominion Museum and see the artefacts that have not been repatriated to Hope Island. For all of those things that you say apply here and now in Tāmaki Makaurau.
Yeah, indeed. And we have objects from Benin in Otago. We have bronzes that we are keeping captive.
And we have the Te Rā sail, which is only on loan still from the British Museum.
How kind of them.
I think we were talking about the sail last week and the way that it has only recently been on loan, and a lot of the funding that was used to enable scholars to go and visit the museum was set up by the Royal Foundation, which has been in existence for about 150 years, but it all just becomes part of the same cycle, and the sail has not been liberated in the same way. People are allowed certain access to it.
Yeah, I think the whole idea that the artifact or the object has the status of being part of the institution's property is the ultimate, to use a very current term, gaslighting. These objects that you see in the film, the 26 objects that were repatriated from the Musée du Quai Branly, have been liberated from having the status of the inalienable possession, which in France means that all of the objects that you see in these museums and these art galleries are under the protection of being inalienable property, i.e. it is property of the state, of the public, because that is what the museum exists as. It's there for the public, for everyone. And because of that, it cannot be repatriated back to individual people or societies that it's come from, because it's the state of the sort of French public, which when you think about that is interesting, because it's like the public that have the means to access the museum and be sort of part of that audience, like very readily. But what I find interesting is that this idea of the inalienable possession or property is actually a concept that came from these very ethnographic studies on Pacifica and Polynesian sort of structures of hierarchy and object status, and the, for instance, an object that might be part of that is passed through generations. That whole idea of the inalienable property comes from those sorts of objects that you have moving through ancestral sort of lineage. And that's why it's like kind of the craziest thing is that the whole legal argument for why these objects cannot and should not go back to their place of origin actually comes from non-Western structures of object-oriented relations. I find that quite interesting.
Yeah, that's super interesting to think about. I guess like the other thing that is maybe related that occurred to me in that film was like one way that the repatriation discourse is complicated is that like it is seen as the people who are requesting or using the political power to move the object back. It is also through this language always of the state. It is a form of soft power. We have things returned here because New Zealand is powerful, Papua New Guinea does not. Human remains languish in European museums from many Pacific nations without the political power to make their return happen. And so you were thinking like repatriation is like the solo endeavor of a state. But what would like conjoint, what would a kautahitanga of return mean, right? Like why does it have to be one at a time? Why can we not assist the return of objects to Africa and honour our deep and long-standing Afro-Oceanic ties? Why can't we work on that too? If we can get objects back here, we should assist the return of objects everywhere.
It's funny, I suppose the museum is it's sort of like time frames. Things work so slowly, and it's like so sees itself as this exempt sort of timescale from the actual public, even though it's sort of serving the public. Things move so slowly, and there are so many rules and regulations that just latch on and just like cannot and will not liberate fast enough from the objects that are in these collections. I guess, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I guess it just like also occurs to me that we are basically like another byproduct or side effect, right? It's like we have to then have an extreme object fetishism, like the return of objects or the display of objects is contingent that they will be loved. And that type of love is coercive. Like love that you have to have is coercion. And that is sort of the program that is being run out unconsciously. And that's not to say one can't have joy in the museum. I certainly do. I went on a date semi-recently, and we went to Hotanui in the Auckland Museum, and we looked at Erea, the taniwha for Ngāti Hako, and it was like meeting the parents, and it was great. It was great. but like, it's a joy we should give up for a greater political project of complete and utter decolonization. And the museum will be 100% a Māori space, like this country will be 100% a Māori country, and it is so close that we should just do it now.
I mean, that would be an amazing note to end on, but yes.
Me or Luke or either?
Well, I'll go first. I think immaterial culture was, by dint of its immateriality, easier preserved. It was free. It couldn't be captured. So there is a kind of unclarity for what museological objects should do, because the lives of the people they belong to have changed, right? That's undeniable. But I thought also, as you were saying that, about this comment Dion Brand made, the poet or philosopher, and she said, she went to the museum and whilst looking at an object realized that colonialism makes the lives of the colonized look brief. And I think like somehow that object fetishism that is cultivated by the repatriation process does something similar. Like everything in the world is complicated in its kind of entanglement with everything else. And so the isolated things, the imprisoned things that have been reformed and set free are then somehow not re-entangled, right? Or at least the re-entangling is something that needs to be monitored to kind of extend that prison analogy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to sort of have this object within all of these like physical and then immaterial processes that are meant to preserve it for as long as possible, it even further pushes forward to the front that this thing can and will perish, and maybe it should perish. I do think that what also is interesting on the conversation that those students had around the fact that their culture and their vitality is still present and in the country, and within them, that there is a shift, right? So the objects that have now come back that were once intended for sacred worship now represent a sort of fear of that worship that has been de-instilled from the people and has been sort of created to seem taboo, and thus there's a disconnect and almost like an alienation from the object. And as one of the students said, it now is art. It is not actually just a direct extension of ourselves and our relationships to one another and to land and to our ancestors, but it actually now is something to fear because it's representative of this removal from ourselves and our culture that we cannot escape. And so maybe it should perish for that reason. Yes, that's definitely something that struck me as well.
I think I've been speaking to a lot of people recently about like the notion of ancestors. There have been some amazing lectures recently, and there's an artist called Brian Duarte visiting from Australia who has a performance that kind of speaks to, I guess, part of it, like the idea of looking toward ancestors as beacons, but then reimagining that as like looking toward them as something that infects our space, and what the idea of being an infection can do. And we were speaking about this a lot, like in relation to Palestine and artists wanting to protest against this genocide. And there are a lot of artists that have refused to make work or refused to participate in institutions because they feel that that's the best way, just to divest from what is happening. And then this other line that you could explore, which is becoming a parasite in the space and infecting some kind of change through continuing the lineage of what you do and what your forebears have done.
Should I read this thing? Well, I mean, I don't really know enough, but I have been...
So just quickly, the question was around language and whether language can be repatriated.
Yeah, I'm not an expert, and that is a field where like many experts are, but I've spending like a lot of time in the constitutional transformation kind of conversation lately. And one thing you realize is like the political organization with Māori has been very clear that reo is like task one, you know? And so I think like I would hesitate to even think about to consider repatriation, because like I have no doubt that language is always being smuggled and held and kept alive and cared for, and even if it's illegible to us, it doesn't, you know, we have to recognize what's absent and respect its absentness. And yeah, travesty that she doesn't have that expression, but someone will, right? Or we like operate with that belief politically.
Yeah, I think what's quite interesting about what that young woman expresses is, I don't know that past time in terms of a time before the French language was enforced and French rituals and ways of being were enforced. I don't think that can be repatriated. I think it can be sort of looked towards and expressed, but if that is the language that you were sort of raised with and that is how you express yourself, it's very difficult to sort of go back to that. And from what I've experienced being in Senegal, for instance, which is not Benin, but still had sort of French colonialism, is there's this sort of hybridization of culture and of language, and you sort of have different threads of it. You have some people that completely reject the language as a whole, that completely reject that sort of any sort of semblance of Frenchness. But because, I guess so I don't know that it can be repatriated in the sense that, and this is something that I feel like the character of the statue touches on, is that this place is not what it once was, and that you can never go back to that past, but you can sort of be present within it or look to it, holding what you know. And that's also like quite an interesting conversation currently. So the objects that were repatriated sort of came, and that we see in the film, came about through the President Emmanuel Macron having this speech, and then he sort of commissioned this report to be made by conservators and art historians within sort of France and West Africa. And one of those historians, she speaks quite a lot to, this question of, there are people that say, well, why can't everything just be repatriated back? And I mean, why can't it? But in the sense that it has not been yet, since those reports which came out in 2018, very little, if not none, no further objects have actually been repatriated back to Africa from France or from any other European countries. And so this historian who wrote this report, she sort of speaks to the idea that, well, if anything, we should be, and she's talking about herself as part of French society, that frequent museums, these populations that are able to sort of have this relationship with these institutional spaces, that if anything, we should be in our seeing and viewing these objects and these relationships that we have with them, we should be looking at them and with the whole, and holding within ourselves the whole knowledge that there is this complexity, rather than just appreciating the knowledge and going, oh well, too bad for the Beninois, too bad for the Senegalese that they didn't get their objects back. But it should be, the viewing should be held with the knowledge that there is this complexity, and that sort of increases the, I suppose, the relation between the viewer themselves and the object. But that was a bit of a tangent, sorry.
If we're wrapping up, I'll read it. I feel like I should say I'm not totally naive about the subject of museums. I lived in an ethnographic museum for about 6 months, and there is kind of radical museology, right? So Ariala Aisha Azule has the proposal that museums should be the kind of pathway to a legal right. So if repatriation doesn't occur, her proposal is like, if an object is in a museum, you have a right to travel. You must have a right to travel to that city. And people think of these spaces as that there are things to do with them, right? I mean, I think total repatriation should be the goal. But I also think that won't end the museum. And that repatriation is actually a really generative process. One object goes, but a relation is built. And all this work needs to be done to figure out the repatriation process, and ties are made, and sometimes more things go back to the museum. So the abolition of the museum via repatriation is actually the expansion of it. It's just freedom from its colonial mentality.
Like an unraveling of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wanted to read something from that time when I lived in a museum, like an object. And it's not written by me. And in that time, I was asked to make a work. And part of making a work was spending time with objects. And instead, I didn't make an artwork, but I gave the production budget to a mosque who used it to help a family send a recently deceased member home, right? So it was just like, think services, don't think masterpieces. And then that was quite a cool process in my life. That was quite an interesting thing that happened. And it happened because I worked with this kind of radical museum critiquer called Clementine Delis. And this is her manifesto, and it gives you a lot of info really, really quick, so I thought I'd read it to you. Manifesto for Rights of Access to Colonial Collections Sequestered in Western Europe. Where are we now? 26 years since the first edition of Dakar, the Biennale of Visual Arts in Senegal. 26 years since Alpha Omer Konaré, former president of Mali and president of ICOM, stated that it's about time we questioned the fundamental basis of the situation and killed, I repeat, killed the Western model of the museum in Africa in order for new methods of conservation and promotion of our heritage to flourish. Let's think back to these colonial museums. 1863, St. Louis in Senegal and the Museum of Tropical Africa. 1907, Windhoek, Namibia, and the museological structure in colonial Germany. 1910, Nairobi, Kenya, Lagos, Nigeria, and the museums founded by British imperialism. And 1 century later, in 1966, in the throes of post-independence, the Museum Dynamique of Leopold Senghor Senghor, that dynamythical museum opens in Dakar, rest in peace. And with it all the desire for internationalism, for festivals, gatherings and workshops, those manifestations of village d'art in Dakar, the artist collects of Tink and Hui Fukui in the infamous Laboratoire Agi Art, rest in peace. And slowly, but far too slowly, the issue is raised of collections in Europe, engendered by imperialism and the market, by noxious colonialism with its sinister discourse and serial kleptomania. These collections locked up still today in the vaults of ethno-colonial museums in Western Europe. Intellectual and governmental plantations, notions of imperialist progress, the monoculture of ethnography, disciplinary and discursive closure, taxonomies and scientific racism, metabolisms covered in blood, colonial mentalities, rest in peace. What to do today with the mass of what are called objects. Objects and collections that are named ethnographic. Object witnesses in the words of Marcel Grial. Objects from the market in tribal art, these millions of artifacts, all inordinate quantity in Europe alone, all without author, without intellectual rights, incarcerated by ethnology and its genealogies, which originate more than not outside the countries of origin, identified by collecting, resales, and swapping between museums, a provenance at home in the salons and secret gardens of patrons, like from Nelson Rockefeller to Marc Lachire. All these objects are in inaccessible depots under the Seine in Paris, where sleep in the holdings of ships built for slavery, those muted bodies, these human remains, or otherwise secreted in the urban periphery, in the prison house of radical difference and negativity, in that fridge freezer of the soul, confined because of their double or triple toxicity, as carriers of microme, capable of unleashing unexpected pandemics, or so they tell us. Necropolitics of sequestered objects, hyper-restrictive access, discursive claustrophobia, exerting control over future interpretations, because anything is possible if you omit the artist, the author, the producer, and the name of the undocumented to replace it with ethnos. Where are we now? Restitution? Yes, please. Provenance research? Yes, please. Retrace the biography as objects acquired or stolen? Yes, please. And find out where those object hunters and organ poachers of the other excluded? Yes, please. But where? With whom? With what? Okay, so reify omission instead, return to the source, bring back the handmaidens of colonialism, the priests of ethnographical phantasmagoria, encourage their humanic labour once more, restore the legitimacy of their discipline, just as they're about to go into retirement? Not sure? No thanks. That's when the European state monogamously walks in hand with the Universal Museum of the 21st century. Now go get a visa to visit your heritage. In Paris, Berlin, Brussels, London, Amsterdam, Vienna, framed by a display fashioned by interior design, exclusive and expulsive and expensive, an exhibition that only adds a sentence or two because that's the point. They didn't document much on those colonial collecting expeditions, did they? Instead it was collect. The expiration of the name of the engineer, the artist, the architect, the bombs of World War II that destroyed the archives, the fires in the reserves, we know them all too well. Yet what a relief for biographical analysis. What comfort for the status of the masterpiece. But then how to heal the colonial wound? Kill the museum, declared Alpha Konaré. Hold on. We must insist upon restitution, but not blindly, at the pace of a snail. We won't wait for ethnographical resuscitation from the organ trade to restore the ghosts of the past. We won't wait for the discourse of provenance with its polite politics, step by step, piece by piece. We have to act now while restitution is underway and push for legislation between museums for the rights of access to the art histories of the world held in the British Museum, the K. Brownlee, the Humboldt Forum, the Tropen Museum, Royal Museum of Africa in Brussels, the Welt Museum in Vienna. Open up those bunkers. Let's build a museum university. Physical and conceptual spaces for remediation with an architecture made for healing and reinterpreting these ancient objects. Let's face their stubborn materiality which has been so terribly neglected. Build incongruous and problematic assemblages. And yes, integrate digitization. But wait a minute, who will select what is to be digitized? Who will access these material worlds, knowing and hidden and forgotten, if not the priest of ethnology and the market? And let's not forget the parameters of conservation, the ideology of material survival, which is remarkably impenetrable with its long durée of 1,000 years or more. No more monocultures, no more intellectual plantations, no more museum mimicries, no more aesthetic hegemonies, no more object hierarchies, no more museum pyramids, that absent air conditioning, the inadequate conservation. Let's take control of these reservoirs of ingenuity and change the ergonomy of museums, those all-gone accumulators of consumerism. Build spaces for inquiry, with rooms for conceptual intimacy, with sites for transport art production and disciplinary transgression, centered on these anxious and contested collections. Return both respect and cooperate back to the ancestors, organs and alliances, all of you, artists, writers, curators, filmmakers, lawyers, architects, ecologists, brothers and sisters, there is no time to lose.
Kia ora, Luke and Yana. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. I think we're going to wrap up here unless there are any final questions. Thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.